Okay, so today we are going to talk about feeding from an occupational therapy lens. And I just wanted to go ahead and say if you have, because feeding will build upon itself. So a lot of the concepts we'll talk about today will continue to build upon themselves. So if you have a question at any time, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll try and answer it as we go. And then obviously we can have time for questions at the end. So our first slide is I just kind of wanted to give you a brief overview of what occupational therapy is and why feeding is something that occupational therapists are primed to deal with. So occupational therapists work with individuals of all ages and abilities, and we help them do the things that they need to do and the things that they want to do. And the way we do this is by engaging our clients in their occupations, which is basically another word for activities. And so that's kind of the unique beauty of occupational therapy is that we help people to do by doing with them. And so this right here is a graphic pulled from our framework, which kind of shows you some of the different occupations or activities that occupational therapists are involved in. And as you can tell, feeding is under here, as well as health management, which I would consider to be part of feeding. And then I would even say that when we think about feeding, it could probably also fit into the social participation, especially since if you think about any large celebration that we have, there's almost always food involved and there's almost always someone eating with us. So feeding kind of is unique because it fits into multiple of the different domains in occupational therapy. So today we're going to talk about what you can do when feeding gets difficult. And then next slide. So I wanted to take a second to pause before we dive into the presentation today, because I think as a healthcare professional, a lot of times it's easy to lose sight of what the definition of health is, as well as all the factors that can impact one's health. And so I just included a definition today, kind of from some of the researchers that focus on intuitive eating, who said that there's a lot more to health than what you eat. It's your relationship with food, your mental health, your social determinants of health, to name a few. And then I also included this word search from online because it just kind of points out, in my opinion, all the different factors that go into feeding. So when we talk about treating someone who might have a feeding difficulty, we want to make sure that when we're treating them, we're also cognizant that we're maintaining a good relationship with food for them lifelong, that we're respecting their mental health, that we're cognizant of the social determinants of health, right? What does this family have access to? What is the cost associated with this? How much time do they have to prepare it? What is their culture and what is that? How does that play in a role? And so just kind of an overall reminder that with feeding, there's so a lot of things that go into it. And convenience and all these other issues can come into play. So it's good to step back before we meet with a client to just kind of remind ourselves of what we're really looking for when we're talking about healthy eating. Okay, so let's start off by defining picky eating, because picky eating is a term, especially in the healthcare profession or as a mom, that you hear a lot, and we may have even used to describe our own children or our own clients, but it's hard because if you talk to anyone, they have a very variable definition of picky eating, even among professionals. So generally speaking, picky eating includes rejecting certain types of foods or food groups that are necessary for a balanced diet, consuming a limited diet, being unwilling to try new foods, etc. In addition to there being a lot of definitions on picky eating, it's hard to understand if picky eating is normal, right, part of development, or if it's something that is going to require treatment or intervention from a healthcare professional. And so what we do know that right now is that picky eating seems to peak in toddlerhood for a variety of reasons. There's the evolutionary perspective, which shows that being cautious of new foods is protective. Children are experiencing a growth in their autonomy, and they're going to exercise some of that autonomy through their food selection. And growth slows down significantly by the age of 2. So it's hard to figure out, are they being selective or are they just not as hungry as we are used to them being? In addition, we know that about 30% of typically developing children will at one point have problems with eating, and about 80% of children that have a developmental disability will have a feeding problem. Which brings us to the next slide. There are a lot. I think I've done a deep dive and there are about 60 different tools that you can use to assess picky eating. But this is one of the screeners that I like. It was developed by Feeding Matters, and it can kind of help us keep in mind when we should be concerned about screening or about picky eating, or when it's maybe developmentally appropriate. And so with this screener, it's really simple to run through either as a parent or with your clients, and any more 2 or more orange answers would then warrant contacting a pediatrician or doing a further comprehensive screen, which involves more questions. So things like your child letting you know they're hungry, eating enough, it taking way too long to feed your child, or your child eating in less than 5 minutes, having to do special items, things to make your baby eat, which that could be making them a separate meal, having them eat separate from the family, using a high chair or restraint to like keep them at the table if they're one of those people that like to run away, using distractions to get your child to eat, all sorts of things. Does your child let you know when they're full, or do you have concerns about that? So like I said, this is just one screener out there. It doesn't necessarily cover all the symptoms, but it's one of the quicker screeners that can really be useful when first meeting with the client. Feeding is too comprehensive to develop into all of it. So today we are not going to address all of it, but I did want to mention that it is really important to rule out underlying conditions first, because having an underlying condition can have a huge impact on future eating. So some of those underlying conditions are GERD or acid reflux, having swallowing difficulties or aspirating on food, having oral motor difficulties. So someone who maybe has some oral motor deficits or some, decrease of strength or the ability to chew, who can manipulate the food from side to side of their mouth, difficulty breathing or cardiac problems, because our body's number one goal is breathing. And so if we're focused on breathing and staying upright, we're going to have a lot less time to focus on food. And if you also think about it, it's really hard to eat when you have a stuffy nose. So things like that can be exacerbated when you have more severe difficulty breathings. And then allergies. And the reason we want to think about these and rule them out, we also want to keep them in the back of our mind if they've been part of their past medical history but have been resolved. And the reason I say that is, let's say someone had acid reflux, or they had difficulty chewing or swallowing, or they didn't they had GI problems or they got sick after they ate it. That can have a long-term effect on their eating. So if you think about us, if you're a typical developing eater, if we eat a food and then we get sick the next day, we're probably going to avoid that food for a long time. So children, if they've had pain after they been eating, or if they had a scary experience with not being able to breathe, that can make them more wary of food, and it can also kind of get them to be stuck and unable to eat new foods or non-preferred foods, or it could cause anxiety and stress around eating. So it's just something also to be aware of. Even if they've been resolved medically, it can have an impact on their feeding in the future, and just something to be aware of. They might need more time and take longer to warm up to the food just because they have a negative history associated with it. Okay, so now that we've kind of covered the basics, we'll dive into what we use as the framework when it comes to approaching children who have, well, actually all children, all eaters, but in particular to children that are picky eaters. This framework was developed by Eileen Slater, and it's called the Division of Responsibility. And it lays out the ground rules on what your role is in feeding and what your child's role is when it comes to feeding. Oh, sorry. Oh, nope, sorry, that went way too forward. Okay. So initially, when I see a client, I'm going to introduce this framework, and we're going to focus with the caregiver on understanding their role. And really, their role is to create an environment that establishes a sense of safety for the child and lends itself for the child to be able to explore new foods. These ground rules are that the caregiver is in charge of what. So they get to choose what food to serve, and they get to prepare the food. They get to choose where the food is served, and they get to choose when the food is served. And oftentimes, I think we have a lot of initial fear that these ground rules might be not enough to address picky eating, especially the more complex cases. But there have been studies that showed that out of 45 families, the ones that had consistent family rules and routines had children that were more likely to try novel foods, because it creates this predictable and comfortable experience, which allows then the children to go out and explore novel food in a pressure-free environment. We know that as parents and as practitioners, we want food our kids to eat, right? So sometimes those pressuring strategies are very well intentioned because we're concerned from them and it's coming out of a place of love. But taking a direct approach to feeding and pressuring the children to eat or restricting certain foods, even using food as a reward, has been shown to lead to decreased dietary intake for children. And it has also been associated with children being overweight, having a lower quality diet, and a lower responsiveness when it comes to food. So not noticing when they're full, because we're encouraging them to eat past their point of being full, and then we're inhibiting their ability to self-regulate. And it can even lead to unhealthy weight control behaviors on the other end, such as restrictive or binge eating patterns. They also found that mothers who use minimal pressure during feeding had children who had a greater understanding of the role of food in their health. So while it seems like these rules might not be enough, there have been studies that show that having these consistent rules and reducing the pressure can lead to better outcomes in eating. We're going to dive a bit deeper into the rules. The first rule is what. So that is the caregiver gets to decide what they're going to serve. So the first picture here, catering versus exposing. When we serve either a meal or a snack, we want to provide children with at least one safe or preferred food, because we want the kids to know that when they come to the table, there's always going to be something that they enjoy and always going to be something that they feel safe eating. Now, this is to say, like apples is one of my kids' safe food. So let's say I decide to serve an apple with peanut butter and crackers, and they come to the table and they decide that they don't want to eat their safe food. That doesn't mean that you have to go out and find a new safe food so that they're eating something. It just means that you want to provide a safe food in every meal or snack. And then we also suggest that you serve a non-preferred food. And I like to go a little bit further and say that I would serve the non-preferred food. I'd make sure it's something that you want to introduce to your child and something that you like to eat. And I would say that for two reasons, because we want parents to be able to model to their child eating the non-preferred food. So if you're serving your child a cucumber and you don't like them, you're missing out on that opportunity to model that. And I think sometimes as parents, we spend so much time on cooking for our kids. And if we cook a meal that we don't like and we're hoping they're going to eat and they don't eat it, I think it can lead to some frustration or letdown. So I would say try and make the meal, the non-preferred food, something that you're going to eat that's going to be part of your regular routine, rather than going out of your way to find a non-preferred food. And then that allows the whole family to be eating the same meal. The second thing when we want to set the plate is we want to do smaller servings. And the reason is this: first of all, a lot of us adults, we are going to overestimate what a normal serving size for children is. And then second of all is if you have a smaller serving of foods, it can be a lot less overwhelming to the child. So they're not as overwhelmed by the new food or the non-preferred food you're putting in front of them. And I think sometimes as parents, it's hard when we're serving foods that they're not eating, because it can lead to concerns about food waste, which are very valid. And so if we serve a smaller portion, it can help reduce some of that food waste, sorry. And then the last thing that I like to do is I like to remove all the packaging when serving food. So even if you're out and you're serving, veggie straws, if you can take it and put it on a plate rather than serve it in the bag, it can remove packaging. Can become a signal for kids, right? They see that package, they know exactly what it is. Marketing is very good, and they know that it's going to be the same every single time. So even if we can remove that package, we can start to break that association down a little bit. And it might allow them to be more accepting of different brands or different other things, as if we kind of remove that neon sign that something is different. So that's the what. In addition to the what, I know we kind of talked about what to serve. This is another thing I suggest, is that if you are doing a dessert or a sweet with your dinner, we recommend serving it alongside the dinner food. And this is something I think that is counterintuitive for a lot of us. But the reason is that we don't want to take this dessert, let's say this cookie, and we're elevating it to special status, right? And you have to eat your cucumbers in order to get the cookie, because putting it on the same plate makes them all level playing field. There was a study that used broccoli as a reward, and the kids started to treat broccoli kind of like they would a cookie. So I think sometimes elevating that status doesn't help. And then it also, when we make children eat their food before they can have their dessert, it teaches them to overeat. So they're eating dinner, they eat to their full, and then comes the dessert. They might be more likely to overeat. So if we serve it all on the same plate, it allows children to naturally explore their boundaries, and it can also lead to less restrictive and disordered eating around junk food later on in life. And there are even studies that have shown that if you have restrictive feeding can inhibit their self-regulation, and it results in the child having greater interest in the restricted food. So if you have a food that is kind of treated as off limits, it kind of increases their interest in it. In addition, sometimes we say, if you're serving a dessert, I would let them control how much of the dessert they want. I mean, if the ice cream runs out, the ice cream runs out, but allows them to explore their natural boundaries. And it also helps them learn natural consequences. And so I'll say this, we were on a road trip with my son the other day, and he went a little bit too hard. They each get to pick out like some road trip snacks on the candy. And so we got home that night and he goes, Mom, my stomach is mad at me. And I said, well, or doesn't feel good. I said, oh no. And he goes, I think it's because I ate too much candy. So it kind of allows them to figure it out and find their own body's happy place. And natural consequences often are sometimes better teachers than the enforced ones. So that's the what. The next is the where. So we get to pick where we decide to serve the food. So first, we recommend always trying to eat at the table, and that includes snacks, and then limiting distractions, which are specifically screens, that could even be background TV, and toys. And the reason is that studies have found there's a correlation between screen time and the consumption of junk food, emotional and behavioral problems at mealtime. Also, by eliminating distractions, we're allowing our children to focus on the food that we're serving, the company, and really be present in the environment. The other thing that we do is we recommend if eating together as much as you can as a family, and that even includes snacks, which I know is hard because sometimes those are when we have less time on our hands. And there are numerous studied benefits of family meals. Children and teens tend to eat better when they eat as a family. They feel better about themselves, so they have lower rates of depression and anxiety. They're more likely to do better in school. They're less likely to be overweight, abuse drugs, or smoke. And it gives children a chance to see their parents model healthy eating habits, because when children see that, they are less likely to be reported as picky eaters. They're more likely to try disliked vegetables, and they have, in general, a higher in vegetable and fruit intake and a decreased risk of disordered eating. So there's lots and lots of benefits to eating as a family and having that model, but you can only have that model if you're serving everyone the same food, which is why we talked about trying to have everyone eat the same food. They also report feeling more loved and connected to their parents when they have frequent family meals as compared to children that don't. The next one is seating or positioning. So we talked about this a little bit before, but our body has priorities, right? Our priority number one is to remain breathing. And our priority number two is to keep an upright position, which we call postural stability, right? Our body can't be falling over. So when we put children down to eat, if we don't have supportive seating, a lot of their energy and focus is going to go on keeping that upright position, and less energy and focus can go on trying to eat, especially if this child has, maybe some weaker muscles or a history of aspiration, where we do really want more energy focusing on the mechanics of eating. So studies that have found that if you have improper positioning, it can lead to coughing, reduced swallow functioning, and increased risk of aspiration. So we talk about the 90-90 rule, and this is for everyone they eat. It's ideal to have 90-degree angle between your hips and your back, right? So up against a chair with the back, 90-degree angle at your knees, and then a 90-degree angle at your foot. And so I think the foot support is one I see most common with children sitting in high chairs, is that a lot of high chairs don't have foot support. And so you can hack it a lot of ways, but oftentimes my favorite thing to do is just take an exercise band and wrap it around the high chair. And that can be really simple, easy, cheap fix to provide that foot support. And then also making sure that we have that back support. In addition, when we have postural stability, so when we have trunk control, in OT, we like to say it enables distal mobility, which is distal, like at your hands. And basically, when you have that trunk support, you're more able to manipulate your spoons and your forks, which can make self-feeding easier, especially for are kids that have a harder time with those motor components. And then conversation. So we've said that we want to eat as a family, but what should you talk about? For many of us, meal times can be unpleasant, whether it's our child refusing to eat, which can cause a lot of stress. And we want to reverse that and make meal times a pleasant part of the day. And so if you focus our conversations on our part of the day or our favorite superhero, that can kind of remove the pressure on eating. So we don't really want to talk about eating during the conversation. There is even research that suggests that talking about food can impact eating behaviors. So one study found that parents encouraging their child to eat actually led to reduced vegetable consumption. So at dinner, we just kind of want to remove the conversation around food. I will also say that while we want to have a pleasant and we can talk about other things for certain children, especially maybe for child's diagnosed with autism, we want to be respectful of their social needs, right? So maybe dinner time, maybe they've had a lot of social demands placed on them. So it's more okay to be quiet. I don't want you to think that you have to be sitting there and having a conversation and your child has to be engaging about it. It's really just meeting them where they're at and taking the focus of the conversation off food. And then the last thing that caregivers are in charge of is setting the schedule. So most kids need about 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks per day. And we want to have a consistent schedule with about 2 to 4 hours in between meals and snacks so that when children come to eat, they are actually hungry, right? So they have that motivation to eat, but they're not too hungry, which can increase problem behaviors and lead to overeating, right? In addition, studies have looked at grazing and found that there's correlations between grazing and anxiety, depression, body image, and more restrictive feeding practices. So kind of having that good balance between being hungry but not over hungry. And then length. We want to make sure that our snacks and our meals are an appropriate length, so our children have enough time to sit down, slow down, and eat. There is mixed literature regarding the ideal meal length, but there was one study that was done that showed if you take a family meal and increase it by an average of 10 minutes, they saw an increase in fruits and veggies, an increase in water and sugar beverages drank, but not an increase in amount of bread, meat, or dessert eaten. So I do think there is some evidence that indicates that maybe having slightly longer meals, even upwards to 30 minutes in length, can be beneficial and lead to more fruit and veggie consumption. In addition, they did another study that showed that longer meal times were not associated with more picky eating habits or more negative mealtime behaviors. So I think it's important to give our children maybe a little bit more time than we thought to really work on eating some of those harder to eat foods. And then when we say that snacks are little meals, we mean that the rules that apply to snacks also apply to meals. So all of the things we've talked about, sitting together, serving a variety, limiting distractions, those are all going to apply. Oh, and then lastly, we want to try and serve only water between snacks and meals. I did want to mention something that can be challenging, especially when it comes to children with autism, that in regards to the schedule. And so this is called interoception. And interoception is the sense of our internal organs. And it's basically how we know when we're hungry, right? Because we can feel it in our body. It's how we know if we're hot or cold. It's how we know if we have to use the restroom, right? The feeling of our bladder. And this can be impacted in children with autism. So there have been studies that show that children with autism might struggle more with recognizing what their body is feeling. And so this is one reason that that schedule can be helpful because they might be less likely to recognize when they're hungry. But by kind of creating that schedule, we're hoping naturally by about 2 to 4 hours, they will be hungry even if they don't recognize it. In addition, it can be helpful with our children with autism, not only to put that schedule in place kind of as a fail safe, but we do know that they're going to grow up and eventually they're going to be in charge of their own schedule. So it can be helpful to help them explore the way they feel when they need food, when they're thirsty, when they're full, and in a way that's unique to them. So what I mean by that is sometimes when you're working on having children with autistic children identify their feelings, we kind of put our feelings on them. So we say, hunger is when your stomach's growling, rather than asking open-ended questions so they can discover what their stomach feels like, because their stomach might feel different when it's hungry, right? So we want to be very mindful that we are not just putting the our feelings onto them. Uh, and interoceptive awareness is another reason why we want to avoid more compliance-based approaches when it comes to feeding, because if we're telling a kid, like, you have to continue to eat one more bite, right? We are derailing them because we're conditioning them to ignore what their body's telling them. And that's especially difficult when a child is having a harder time understanding what their body's telling them in general, right? We're conditioning them to ignore that information and to meet the demand that the parent is placing on them in order to please that person. So when we kind of remove the pressure to eat, we are also going to honor their body's feelings and hopefully lead to more interoceptive awareness, which is really important for that just ability to regulate what your body needs. Okay, so the child's role, and their child role is very simple. They get to eat. They get to decide if they want to eat at all, if they want to eat the food that you present, and how much they want to eat. So if they decide not to eat at all, that's up to them. If they decide to eat one bite, that's up to them. If they only eat one bite of their preferred food, that is up to them. And the reason we say this is because when we offer a reward for eating, when we try and persuade them to eat, when we pressure them to eat, all of these things have been shown to be associated with picky eating, which is the problem we're trying to solve. So we want to take all of that away. And then real quick, in regards to the child choosing how much to eat, we do want to acknowledge there are practical limits. So my kids love taco meat. And if we are serving tacos that night and they want to eat more and more and we run out, that's okay, right? Because that's a practical limit. I'm not going to go to the stove and make more taco meat. So we do want to respect the natural constraints that you have around your house, your time, your budget. So when food runs out, that's okay. Food runs out. What we don't want to do is saying, oh, you can't have a second serving of taco meat because you've had too much of that already and you haven't tried the other food on the plate. Or you can have a second serving if you try one bite of tomato, things like that. So we don't want to take away, the natural constraints of our lives, because those are very real. We just don't want to limit children's food outside of that. So we've gone over that we should allow our child to choose what to eat and how much to eat. And that doesn't mean to say that as a caregiver, it's easy to sit back and do that. It's not even easy for me at times. We may try these, what I call sneaky stressors. So they're like little ways to encourage themselves to eating. I've been guilty of it. I'm pretty sure every parent has sometimes. So we just kind of want to mention them because these are sneaky. We don't think of them as pressure to eat, but they really are. So the first one is the optimist, which is like force feeding your child the smile, or the rodeo clown. This is like the parent with the, playing with the food, trying to distract them so they can take a bite with an airplane. The pushy waiter, maybe you're really anxious and so you're trying not to say anything, but you're hovering over the meal. If you were sitting there and someone was looking at every bite that you took with intensity, you would probably feel weird. The snake charmer, singing to get them to eat. The voiceover narrator, maybe self-talk with every bite. So let's say you're working on broccoli and you're like, oh, this broccoli is so yummy. And you keep doing that self-talk. Your child's going to feel that. Same with the salesman person talking about the tastiness of every bite. The home shopping salesman displaying and showing the food, like, oh, look at this. Paparazzi, maybe you're taking a cheer, or you're like, oh, let me take a picture of you eating your broccoli. I'm so excited, things like that. The human calculator. So I see this a lot of times, and I completely understand why in parents of children who are transitioning from feeding tubes, right? Because they've been trained to always be worried about their weight and worried that they're going to lose weight. And so those people can track every bite, gram, and calorie, but it can lead to a lot of pressure that the child is feeling. Someone who's like, are you sure you don't want to try it? After the child says no, or the perfectionist who doesn't notice the small wins, right? Let's say your child tolerated a food on their plate for the first time. I know we want them to eat it, but that is a small win, tolerating it on their plate. So those are just some of those sneaky stressors that can come into play. Okay, so we've covered a lot, and I just want to take a quick break real quick to go over why we want to follow the division of responsibility again and why we want to use responsive feeding practices. We've talked a little bit about it, but just want to hit it again because I think the why can really help drive our practice. And the reason is we want to foster self-regulation in our child, right? We want them to be able to recognize their hunger, express it, and eat. Recognize when they're full and stop. We want that for our children because that's a healthy relationship with food and that's listening to what their body needs. But when we do things like pressure our children to eat or restrict their food, they found that that can be associated with emotional overeating and changes in their ability to regulate their fullness level, as well as is associated with picky eating. So it can kind of become a cycle. So children who are picky eaters are more likely to be pressured to eat by their well-meaning parents, right? We just want them to eat. But that pressure can then lead to an increase in picky eating, and it just kind of becomes this cycle that we need to stop. In addition, I will say that we know nutrition is important. So when you worry that sitting back and not pressuring them is not enough, remember this. There was a study that analyzed mealtime routines and found that 6 aspects of the routine, and those aspects were parent modeling, eating the food, TV off during meals, longer meals, children's involvement in the meal prep, and a positive mealtime atmosphere were linked to healthier nutrition and weight in children. So we're not saying that nutrition isn't important. We're just saying that there are studies that show that these aspects that we've talked about actually do lead to healthier nutrition and body weight. Okay. So now what? Let's say that you've done all the things, you've got the division of responsibility in place, and your child is still not eating. You're kind of stuck. You're thinking, now what am I going to get them to do? So I have a picture here of the grasshopper, and I have to give credit to Marcia Dunn, who is the director of the Get Permission Institute, who came up with this idea. And the question she kind of poses of parents or practitioners is, what would it take for you to eat a grasshopper? So some of us, like my husband, very adventurous eaters, they would try it right away, right? You wouldn't just have to ask them. Other ones of us, like myself, might take some time to try the grasshopper. We might need to see someone else eat it. We need to ask some questions like, okay, what does it taste like? And have them compare it to something that we've eaten before. We might want to touch it. We might want to see it. And we just might need some time to get comfortable with it. And this is how our children is, right? We are going to treat new foods when they're not still trying them like a grasshopper. And we might need to just give them more time to touch it, see it, to get comfortable with it, do some feeding therapy. So the main form of evidence-based feeding therapy is called systematic desensitization or exposure therapy. It goes under a lot of different names, and a lot of different occupational therapists and speech language pathologists have come up with different programs, but really they all boil down to this systematic desensitization. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it is and how you do it. So, like I said, this is the base principle of a lot of different therapies, from the SOS method to the AEIU method to my munch bug, all using the same method. And the idea behind it is that you want to gradually increase the level of interaction a child is having with the food until eventually, hopefully, the child is going to eat with the food. So this can be broken down into tolerating the food in the same room, on the same table, on your plate, right, to interacting with the food. This could be just touching it. It could be playing with your fork, smelling the food, bringing it closer to your face, maybe licking the food. Then we have tasting the food, right? Maybe a small bite, and then eating the food. So it's kind of, we're going to work on to gradually increasing their interaction until they are eating the food. And when we do this, we're going to give your child time and space to interact with the food, which then allows them to feel comfortable, and they may work up to eating the new food. If we think of it kind of like a fear, right? Oftentimes psychologists will treat fear with exposure therapy, right? That gradual exposing to them so they can learn that it is safe. And we're going to do that same with our food. Now, I will tell you that it takes time, right? It takes at least 10 to 15 exposures of a food before we're willing to maybe move to the next step. And some steps are going to be longer than other steps, right? Some foods might be really quick to go through the hierarchy. Some foods are going to be longer. And when we do this, when we try and have increasing that tolerance of the food, we still are honoring our original principles. We are still allowing our child to decide what to do with the food. We are not offering bribes and or rewards for when they do reach the next step. I will also say that some foods, no matter what you do or how long you expose them to it, they're not going to be accepted. But that's okay, because if you think about yourself, I guarantee you there are probably foods on lists that you know you don't like and you're not going to accept. Like, I know that I don't like cashews. It does not matter how long they sit on my plate, how long I touch them or lick them. They're just not for me. And that's okay, right? People can have very well balanced diets. They can go out and they can eat at many different places with having some foods on their not to-do list. So I do just want to remind you, sometimes I think we forget that we ourselves have preferences and foods on our not for me list, and our kids are going to do that same. So this is not going to work for every food, but the goal is to kind of expand that repertoire. And you can do this systematic desensitization in a variety of ways. So you can play with your food at dinner time, but you can also do it through other ways. And we'll talk about that in general. Sorry. I just want to mention this. The other reason systematic desensitization works, especially for some of those more difficult to eat foods, is that when we talk about prepackaged snacks or food from a specific fast food restaurant or something, those foods like the wheat thins shown here are going to taste the same every time, and you're going to know what to expect. But if you're talking about some of the harder to eat foods for children like blueberries, they're going to change their texture and flavor, and they're not going to be the same, right? Sometimes they could be juicy or squishy or sweet or sour. And so there's more variation and less predictability. So that's why sometimes we have to have that longer exposure for our harder to eat foods. So outside of kind of playing with your food at mealtime, there's lots of ways that you can add systematic desensitization into your daily routine. One of those ways could be food prep, so involving your child in the preparation of the food, which kind of removes the pressure from it if they know they don't have to eat it, right? You're just chopping the pepper today, and they make these cool crinkle cutters that are very safe for kids to eat. It could be stirring, sorts of things, grocery shopping, allowing them to touch, put the foods in the cart, get that exposure and familiarity with them outside of the pressure of mealtime too. And there are studies, one in particular, that looked at the relationship between children's involvement in food, that found that involvement in grocery shopping and food prep were associated with less picky eating. In addition, when we're doing this systematic desensitization, food chaining is a great tool that we can use to increase the likelihood that that food will be accepted. And basically what it is you start with a food, let's say it's a favorite chicken nugget, and you're going to make small changes to the food in color, shape, or texture to work towards a new food. So here we have favorite chicken nugget. We're going to try a different brand, right? It's still going to have the same color, shape, and texture, but it's a different brand. Then maybe we try a homemade chicken nugget. Then maybe we try a homemade fish stick. So a fish stick might have the same color and shape, but a slightly different texture, right? So we just made one little change in the texture. Then we might remove some of the breading, kind of further changing the texture, but keeping the color and shape. And then we might go to cooked tilapia, right? New shape, same color, different texture. So it's basically making minor changes along the way to kind of work your way up to that non-preferred food. You just start by picking a food that your child likes to eat, breaking it down and making small changes at a time. My first favorite change is just to change the brand. I think it's super easy on parents, not a lot of as much effort as trying to change, making homemade chicken nuggets. But so you can start really small with food chaining. Okay, so now we are at the case presentation. So I chose a client that I had worked with in the school setting because I think a lot of times, while ideally it's great to go home and actually observe a meal and be a part of that, we are treating our clients in a clinic setting. So she was in a school setting. So we had about 15 minutes snack time with her once a week. She was diagnosed with autism. She had tactile sensitivity, so she did not like things on her hands. Her hands always had to be clean. She was not a fan of glue, paint, sand, anything like that. And she had a very limited diet, particularly when it came to protein. And the intervention, oh no, why is the intervention not showing up? Look, I'm like, please. Okay. So what we did with this client is we focused on her autonomy. And what I did is I love to do when I have a client, I like to do a food inventory. There's so many you can print off, but basically it allows you to write down their foods and know what foods they prefer. So you know their safe foods right off the bat, what foods they're beginning to learn to like, and what foods they don't like yet, but foods that the family would like that to get them to eat. And so I say that because everybody has their own kind of style around eating. And oftentimes, if you can give it to a parent and have it fill out, you have a good idea of the foods that they're going to encounter on a daily basis that the parent would like you to work towards. So we wanted to first focus on her autonomy. So I took pictures from Pinterest, and there's tons of kid cookbooks too, but basically found fun recipes that involved a safe food and a non-preferred food, particularly focusing on the protein. And we put these pictures in a cookbook, and we did it together. So the client and I cut them out, we glued them, we put her name on the front of the cookbook, we put stickers on the page. And then each time we had a snack, she would pick what she wanted to make. So she was very involved in it, and we wanted to respect her autonomy and give her that sense of ownership, which can also lead to a sense of safety. So we would make the food together. Both she and I would have the same snack. So there was that opportunity for modeling. And then I would let her choose what to eat. And we wanted to respect her sensory preferences. So we were doing a lot of work with peanut butter because it was one of the proteins that she would pick a lot. And we made sure that she had a knife to spread it so she didn't feel like she had to touch it. She had a napkin to do it. So she could quickly wipe it off. And we were respecting her sensory preferences and her desire to have those clean hands and nothing on it. And what we found is over time with, the first recipe I think we made was a banana caterpillar, and she got to put sprinkles on it and things like that. We were totally using the knife. We were not touching the peanut butter. We had the napkin at a go. But by the end, we were picking things off the peanut butter and we were eating, like the sprinkle, or I think one time we did chocolate chips. We were eating the chocolate chip that had a little bit of peanut butter on it. Or we were picking them off and then we were wiping the peanut butter off on the napkin, but we were still tolerating that, right? The peanut butter had touched the chocolate chip and we were wiping it off. And towards the end, she was actually eating peanut butter. And I think it took us about 5 or 6 weeks of this, which is faster than sometimes it goes. But throughout the way, right, we were trying to give her autonomy, make sure she always had a safe food, respecting her sensory preferences, not pressuring to eat, but we were kind of gradually increasing that exposure in a fun, playful way. So that is the case study. And here, there's some references here, but I'll stop now to see if people have questions.